Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us this evening. My name is Jessica Brinkley out of the ESP Quality Department, and I will be serving as your moderator for this evening's webinar. This presentation this evening is brought to you by the NEA Center for Great Public Schools, ESP Quality Department. The ESP Quality Department represents and advocates for the nearly 500,000 NEA Education Support Professional members, also referred to as ESP. Our strategic focus is to elevate ESP careers by developing, implementing, and promoting best practices and policies that enhance ESP effectiveness in meeting the needs of the whole student. We provide the tools, programs, and resources to ensure that ESP become empowered leaders, accomplished professionals, and members of a highly qualified education workforce.
The title of this presentation, More Than an Ounce of Prevention, comes from the old saying that an ounce of prevention equals a pound of cure. And that's what this workshop is about, is prevention. You know, we have a number of anti-privatization trainings in our ESPQ department with various focus and degrees of sophistication. The thing I like about this particular training is that it meets locals where they're at in terms of their capacity for activism. So you can be a local without much capacity for activism, but this training will give you a place to start and to build upon. So we're going to begin with a simple definition tonight. So many services are considered so essential to the well-functioning of a society that they are provided by a public entity, a government. And, of course, in our case, we're talking about a school district. And, of course, the folks working for that public entity are public employees, such as our ESP. And when a service, and thus those providing that service, are privatized or outsourced, that means a private contractor is taking over the public service, and the employers, rather the employees, are no longer public employees. But they'll be employees of the particular company that has made the contract with the district to provide that service. So why is it bad to be privatized? Well, for the employee, you have to realize that the private contractor may or may not use the former public employees to provide the service. And whatever agreements existed between the school board and the employees, whether those were formal agreements such as a collective bargaining agreement or just long-standing precedent and understanding. All those are out the door now because you've got a new relationship, and it is with this private entity. It's no longer directly with your school district. And, of course, you'll not have the advocacy of your association unless they reorganize this private entity. And the new employer must now make a profit, something your public employer did not. So why is that a bad thing? Well, the ultimate goal of those who are direct public service is to meet the essential needs of the citizens, or in our case, meet the needs of the students and staff of a school. But a private contractor's ultimate goal is making a profit. And this profit has to happen somehow after the contractor has already made commitments to deliver the service for less money to the district. And keep in mind that private contractors have overhead that public entities don't have. I mean, there's marketing and insurance bonding and shop space, et cetera, Plus, they have to make a profit for themselves if they're a small, individually owned company, or if they're a large company, they even have to make a profit for shareholders. And, you know, how does this happen? In almost all cases, it has to happen by going after the employee's compensation. Because in any service, 75% or more of your costs are actually tied up in the people who deliver that service in their compensation. And the only way you can come in and get your foot in the door with these districts and you know, show them savings and at the same time make yourself substantial profit, is to ultimately go after the employee's compensation, because that's where all the money is going to be in a service. Now, there's a process that these privatizers have to follow, and that process is generally outlined in what's called a procurement process, which is in a state statute, and will cover public entities within the state, including school districts. And there are some variations in those procurement statutes from state to state, but for the most part they follow this process, meaning that there first has to be a request for proposal, known by the acronym RFP, and that's just a written description of the work being privatized and the requirements expected of the contractor. That RFP will be advertised, and then usually the district will hold what's called a bidders conference, where they have like a public meeting where contractors interested in bidding on this service can come for a live presentation and get questions answered. Then the bids are received, the bids are evaluated and ranked, and a contractor is chosen, and then a contract between the district and the contractor is negotiated and ultimately approved by the board. All this is a public process. We shouldn't be first finding out about a privatization threat when it is up for approval by the board, because as you can see, there's quite a bit that goes on before that. And if you're aware of the dealings of your district, you know, hopefully you'll catch that before we're down to the board actually voting on an already drafted contract. Now, speaking of the board, they are the decision makers. And, you know, interestingly enough, sometimes you have to remind them of that. If you have a strong-willed superintendent, sometimes your school board, your Board of Education, forgets that they're actually the boss. And it varies from across the country, but there's, you know, 5, 7, or 9 members usually. And, of course, the name of the game is for us to get the majority, you know, 3 out of 5, et cetera, et cetera. So the board meets publicly at least once a month. In fact, they can't meet in private if a quorum is present. I think pretty much all states now have an open meetings law. And, you know, again, regardless of who may seem to be making the decisions, it is the Board of Education, and that's going to be our target for pressure. Now, the ideal beginning in terms of wrestling with this problem would be for locals to be involved in local school board politics and involved from the foundation. Candidate recruitment, you know, instead of just waiting to see who files and whether or not we can work with that person, actual candidate recruitment, you know, and you know, retired members, the spouses of current members, or members who work in another district but live in your district. All those are actual viable options for candidate recruitment. There should be candidate screening, and ESP should be involved in that process. You know, oftentimes the EA, the teachers local, will take the lead, but it should be a united process, and ESP should be given representation on that screening, and there should be a direct question about privatization and outsourcing. And quite frankly, any candidate who supports privatization should not receive an association recommendation. Now, that's the ideal beginning, but as we promised in the start of this webinar, we realized that, not all situations are ideal. So what we're going to do is we're going to build our activism. The union should establish a culture that's not afraid to fail, that has reasonable expectations and achievable tasks that build a comfort level for activism, because most people are not born activists and they have to be brought along into the world of activism with small victories to begin with that then escalate. To give you an example of what happens in too many places across the country, which is not the ideal, let's say that a local there is a school board candidate running that the local likes, is friendly with, thinks that would be a good advocate for students and employees. And so an enthusiastic either local leader or affiliate staff person says, we're going to put 100 members on the door Saturday morning for this candidate, knocking doors for this candidate. Well, what happens Saturday morning? The one thing I'm sure that does not happen is that there's not 100 members there Saturday morning, and maybe it's as few as a handful, 6 members. But unfortunately, what happens next is crucial, and often it's the wrong thing. What will happen is that people will be embarrassed, angry, panicked. Everyone connected will learn the wrong lesson. The staff person or the activist who tried to organize the canvas will take the lesson that, I'll be darned if I'm going to stick my neck out again and have this sort of thing happen. The local leader may learn the lesson of, oh gosh, you just can't ask my members to do this sort of thing. My members don't show up. And all of this becomes ingrained in the culture of the local. And that was the wrong lesson to take from a situation like this. To begin with, you should have reasonable expectations when you're building your activist base, your capacity. You shouldn't expect it to have 100 members on the doors on a Saturday morning. But once you had that 6 members show up, you should have turned it into the very best experience you could have for those 6 members. Treated them like activist warriors, maybe bought them lunch, et cetera, so that they go back into their buildings Monday morning and talk about a positive experience they had in volunteering with the union, so that, the next time you plan a Saturday canvas, you still don't get 100 members, okay? But maybe you get 10, and maybe the time after that, a dozen, and et cetera, et cetera. So, a culture that's not afraid to take chances and fail, reasonable expectations, and then achievable tasks that build the activism. So, the old joke, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And the first bite that we're going to ask people to take is just a simple showing up. The turn-of-the-century famous blues musician Robert Johnson, he said, the world is run by those who show up. The classic English poet John Milton, who, by the way, went blind, he said, they also serve who only stand and wait. Sort of his way of saying, some folks are doing what they can. It may not be flashy, but they also serve who only stand and wait. So we're going to begin by just asking people to show up at the school board meeting. It's one evening a month. Go to the Board of Education meeting from start to finish. Very few go, fewer stay, and very few go and stay every month. And Board of Education meetings across the country all follow a similar agenda. Basically, the first hour and a half are feel-good items involving students and their parents. So there'll be recognition awards for academics, sports, etc. Then there's a slot for public comment, a comment limited to 3 minutes per person. And all this time, the audience is starting to thin out. You know, the parents leave as soon as their child has received the award. And so it goes. Then they do administrative reports to the board for another hour or two. Finally, it's about 10 p.m., and they're down to do the business section of the meeting. Now, that's not an accident. It is a game. Know the game, but play the game. Showing up at these board meetings can make a huge difference. So you can then build upon, after you've been showing up at the monthly Board of Education meeting and staying from gavel to gavel, then you can start to build upon your comfort level. You sort of get to know these folks. You introduce yourself before or after the school board meeting to BOE members, to administrators you don't know, to parent activists that you heard speak out maybe in the public comment section that seem like, you know, those would be good employee advocates. And then maybe after that you introduce yourself in the public comment section of the meeting. You get comfortable with that. Maybe every month they know that Mary, the custodian, is going to stand up in public comments and is going to say a few words about maybe her local or talk about the jobs that members do. And then continue to build. Maybe introduce a different, start dragging a member with you every month, a different member, and telling their story, what building they work in and what they do for the kids. You know, give public comment every month, talk about the great things your members are doing for kids. Maybe choose a meeting every year where you pack the audience with all your members wearing some sort of an association shirt or color to distinguish themselves, and then introduce them as a group in public comments. Now, here's the thing about what we're doing here. You know, it is relatively easy for a school board to privatize the custodians. It gets a whole lot more difficult for school boards to privatize, you know, Mary Garcia, Tom Jones, Todd Perkins, et cetera, et cetera. It makes all the difference in the world when those individuals become real individuals that they know their names. And it starts with something as simple as going to the school board meeting every month. So take a few minutes to consider. Are you currently doing any of these actions? Which ones you would like to start doing? And what's missing from the list that would be a valuable interaction with your Board of Education? Did you consider you could schedule a meeting with each member of the Board of Education? You could introduce the member to the whole student concept, which will, if you don't know what that is, we'll talk about in a few minutes. You could stress the fact that our ESP are educators. You know, you could, the more you regularize and institutionalize this relationship with the BOE, the better. So you could begin a tradition of meeting every month with the president of BOE. For example, you know, every first Monday would be a breakfast meeting before school at a specific diner in the district. Or every last Friday have a coffee with the after school with the BOE president. You know, whatever works that can be regularized, not just when there is a crisis or a conflict, but a regular contact. And again, all these actions build and get more sophisticated as your capacity in the local for activism builds, until finally you're doing things like inviting a BOE member to shadow one of our association members in their job for a day. The last item about holding a reception for the entire BOE you would want to check with your UNISERV or state affiliate GR people on that. Different states have different rules about what would constitute an open meeting. So that's the only one that there would be a caveat on. So, community. In addition to establishing these personal relationships with our Board of Education, we want to establish community relationships because they are an influencer on that board. So parents are your #1 community target. Parents of children with special needs are a powerful subgroup. And, alumni of the district, senior citizens, taxpayers are all important community groups as well. So take a few minutes to consider, since parents are the #1 community group to influence, how do we do it? How would you contact parents or make your association visible to them? What other community members are out there who might be influential with your BOE? I'm going to pause for just a second before moving on with the presentation to answer an important question that came in. I want to get to it before the train of thought is lost. It's a question about endorsing and campaigning for a school board candidate, and then that person gets elected, and what constitutes a conflict of interest. In other words, if a local got involved in school board politics, endorsed a candidate, helped this person get elected, then would that person on the school board be facing a conflict of interest if they then addressed issues pertaining to ESP? And the answer is absolutely no. Conflict of interest is a term that is thrown around a lot in a general way, but in the legal sense of the word, it pertains to a public governance official actually literally benefiting from their vote or their governance as the case may be. So, if a school board member voted to award a janitorial contract to his wife who runs a cleaning service, that's a definite conflict of interest. There is a real property gain from this individual casting their vote, exercising their governance on the school board. But simply being an advocate for a group, even a group that has campaigned and helped you, and even a group that has donated actual money to your campaign, that's not a conflict of interest. It's having an interest, it's having an advocacy group that you're close to, but you're not benefiting from that monetarily. So thanks for that question. Getting back to community influence, and again, if you've caught on to the way this presentation goes, we give you things to consider, and then we show you examples of maybe how to escalate to keep upping that game of activism. So when you were thinking about reaching out to the community, did you think about PTA and PTO meetings? Many times these little PTO groups are looking for something to put on the agenda, and they would love to hear what a school custodian actually does. and what that job entails, you could easily get on the agenda of one of those, or as a para or food service or whatever. You could your local could sponsor school teams or events. Strengthening the relationship with the teachers local is always good and really a no-brainer. There are other elected political officials that have influence on your school district. So maybe you don't have close relationships with, the school board members, but you've got a state rep who really likes the association and is really pro-employee and pro-public education. That individual can often interface for you and apply a lot of pressure because they're up the food chain and they vote on the state funding and rules that pertain to education. And then there's faith leaders, social justice groups, other unions, parental interest groups, and for paras particularly, if you can get in with, parental groups that are organized around special needs. Those are fierce advocates for their students, for their children, as well often as for the educators providing services for their students. Communications is something that we want to be aware of as we build our activism. You want to identify what media is at your disposal in your community. And of course, nowadays, I think most of us are starting to realize not to believe that television or print media are necessarily the way to go when social media is becoming so overpowering. Find out who currently covers education stories in your community. If you're actually going to those school board meetings and you're staying to the end, you'll often see a person who looks somewhat out of place. It'll usually be a younger person who is staying through the entire meeting and taking notes. That is often the young reporter who gets assigned to the education beat of the local paper, and that's somebody that you should get to know because when a story does come up, they're always looking for quotes, and they're always looking for background, and it can be very powerful for us to have, to have those connections. Okay. So take a few minutes to consider what media is in my area, who currently covers stories connected with my district or education issues, which media strategies should my local use, and how would we get started with a media relationship. So did you consider all forms of social media, such as a Facebook page or a Twitter account? Of course, if you're my age, you remember the days when a website was what you tried to establish, and that actually took someone skilled. Usually you would have to, pay them to set up the website, et cetera, et cetera. Nowadays, of course, your local can have a Facebook page in about 10 minutes, and virtually anybody can learn to use that that medium. Same with a Twitter account. Did you consider education bloggers? This is kind of interesting depending on the part of the country you're in. Sometimes these folks have a lot of sway. These are usually activist parents, sometimes employees, sometimes ex-employees, sometimes school board members who will have a blog and will blog on the education issues in their district. I was Uniserv in the state of Delaware, which is a 3-county state and does not have much media of their own. And these education bloggers, they carried a big stick and would have sometimes thousands of followers. So know your area, know what people are reading and listening to. And, if you do have a situation like this, you could actually arrange to meet these bloggers and establish a relationship. And again, just like that old-time print reporter, they're always looking for stories, for backgrounds, for quotes. So, time to regroup for a moment and just recoup where we've been with this presentation. So the Board of Education are the decision makers, so we want a relationship with them directly, and we want a relationship with those who influence the Board of Education, number one being parents, but also community members, and then the media who influence all of the above. And all of our activism to influence the BOE, to protect ourselves from privatization, and in general to gain power, must build, must escalate. The vast majority of your members are not going to be people who are born activists. It is it's a learned activity, and they've got to be given achievable tasks that gradually increase their comfort level and their commitment. And having this type of escalating, having the capacity to escalate your activism is useful also if you end up in a full-fledged fight with the board over privatization. Because what has happened over the years is, locals pushing back on privatization have always staged the classic packing the board meeting on the night of the vote on the privatization contract. And initially, I think the first few times we've done that in places around the country, that worked. But let's face it, what school boards are learning is that if they just hang in there through one rough night, they can take their privatization vote and, they're fine. That's the problem with not having an escalating campaign. It starts out with small actions and keeps escalating. The actions get stronger, more pressure on the board, more in your face, et cetera, et cetera. In addition to bringing along your activist internal organizing, what it does is it establishes a mindset in the board that they don't know what's coming next, that it's not about just holding on for one bad vote, that this thing is growing, it's getting out of their control, it continues to escalate on them. Take just a moment again, bouncing back over the questions. We had a question that what happens if you end up in a candidate endorsement situation where the ESP don't agree with the teachers on a candidate endorsement? I'm going to be a little careful how I answer that. You should really talk to your state affiliate. Most of the time, most state affiliates that I've both worked with, worked for as a GR director or worked with in my capacity with the NEA, most of them encourage, joint screenings instead of like the teachers doing the screening and the paras doing the screening and the custodians doing the screening, et cetera, et cetera. Most of them encourage, if they're not amalgamated locals to begin with, they at least encourage a unified screening process. So if you have that type of situation or you anticipate that type of situation, I would talk to my UniServe or to somebody in the state affiliate government relations department about that issue and see if your state affiliate can't play traffic cop on that situation. I'm sure they would actually be glad to, because we really don't want to see that type of thing happening. So, you know, we just talked about establishing all these relationships to influence the board, direct personal relationships with the board, and then indirect ways to influence the board through parents and community and media. But once we get the attention of the board, what story do we tell them? What do we want to tell them about who we are as ESP and why privatization is a bad idea? What do you want to tell them about your local, your profession, and yourself that makes this privatization idea a bad idea? So take just a moment to consider, why not privatize? And are there different answers to this question for the BOE, for the superintendent, parents, taxpayers, the media, etc.? It's a little bit of a trick question, because the second item there, are there different answers? Yes, there are different messaging spins that you can use with those different audiences, but what I'm going to give you is one that's more universal. And that is that we as ESP are educators. We educate the whole student. In order for learning to take place, a child has to be, well, I'll show you here in a moment, the 5 tenets of the whole student. You know, our schools are our whole systems. All adults working in that school have a role in educating the students and ensuring, and these are the 5 tenets, that the students are healthy, safe, engaged, supported, and challenged. And we know that what that means is that, you know, the first adult representative of that school district a child sees in the morning is a professional school bus driver that transports them safely to that school. And when they come into that building, they come into a building that is kept safe and clean by the custodian. And they are served food by our child nutrition employees, and they're helped through their day of learning with our paraeducators, and they're helped with most everything with our building secretaries who we all know run the buildings instead of the principals. It's all of that sort of thing which are is tied up in this concept of the whole student. Kids have to be supported in order for learning to take place, and our ESP are important parts of the education team. So take a few minutes to consider, in what ways is my daily job important to kids? What do I do that employees of a private contractor might not want to do or be capable of doing? What sort of things go beyond my job duties that add value to what I do? And what sort of activities would I like to do if given the chance? So here's some creative ways that ESP are educating. We've got food service workers who receive anti-bullying training so that they can diffuse, report, and intervene when necessary. As most of you know, in the last few years, school districts across the country have spent millions of dollars in professional development for classroom teachers on anti-bullying. And yet, we know that most bullying does not take place in the classroom. It takes place on the school bus, in the hallways, in the cafeterias, in the playgrounds, all the areas that are actually the turf of ESP, and yet in far, far too many places, ESP are not given anti-bullying training, and likewise in schools that have holistic disciplinary systems, they're not giving their ESP professional development in that. We have custodians who mentor students. In my travels for ESPQ across the country, I've found this kind of fascinating because it seems to be an organic type of situation that has grown up around the country. And what I'm referring to here is that in high schools and middle schools, it is not uncommon for teachers to have an understanding with a custodian that they will send a particular student to work with that custodian for an hour or so. It just, for some of these kids, the physical activity and the bonding with the custodian just does them a world of good on behavior issues and whatnot. And this seems to be a program that has grown up pretty much organically without custodians receiving formal mentoring training or without this program being named by districts or openly recognized. We have secretaries who sponsor girls clubs, school bus drivers who've turned their buses into mobile libraries. In case you haven't noticed around the country, school districts are tending to get out of the library business now, which is very unfortunate, particularly in our economically challenged schools, because we're not really being thoughtful about this. In economically challenged areas, you know, parents are not able to go on Amazon and buy their kids books. They're working 2 or 3 low-paid service jobs, so they're not able to take the child to the library evenings or weekends. And school libraries for some of these kids were the only access they had to books, and too many of the districts are getting out of the library business. They're closing their libraries or maybe keeping their libraries open 1 day a week and often not having a librarian in there. Sometimes they'll have a paraeducator in there. So the school bus drivers who've thought of this idea, kudos to them. In fact, one of them 2 years ago during the Obama administration was one of the White House champions of change that was recognized. So we've got maintenance workers who do things like facilitate school garden programs. We want to tell the story that ESP are a part of the education team in the school community, that children need a whole team of caring adults in order to provide an environment where learning can take place. You know, our ESP members live in the communities where they work. We've got over 75% live in the district in which they work. Also pretty amazing in terms of education nowadays, where, you know, you've got a large percentage of teachers that don't make it over 5 years. By contrast, ESP on average are employed 12 years, and a whopping 82% plan on staying in their profession. So ESP are skilled at their trades and a whole lot more. So recapping a little bit here, to prevent privatization, we engage in activism, even if our first steps are small and seem insignificant. And, you know, going back to the first part of this presentation, I've been in many places in the country and given this presentation to members, and, you know, and I hear the complaint, oh boy, you know, I'm the president of my local, and I'm the only one who does anything, you know, and you know, so I don't know what to do, you know. And again, that very first step of attending these Board of Education meetings and building off of that and dragging another member with you to attend, and before you know it, you're both giving public comment, et cetera, and building on that is so important. So then the Board of Education is always our end target because they make the decision. So we build a relationship with that board. And again, you know, remember it by the anecdotal, it's relatively easy for a board to privatize the custodians. It's pretty difficult for a board to privatize Mary Garcia and Todd Perkins and Jim Smith, et cetera, when they know these people as individuals. We know that the community, particularly parents, influence the Board of Education, so we build relationships with our parents and members of the community. We know that media influences our BOE and community, so we build relationships there. And we tell stories of our professions and how ESP are stable and committed educators of the whole student. You know, one of the things that we've done here in ESPQ in the last year is to build out what's called a professional growth continuum. And what that does is it takes a look at the 9 career families that make up education support professionals, which by the way are 1/3 of the K-12 workforce, are ESP, and they are in 9 career families. And the professional growth continuum looks at a way to you know, improve and professionalize those 9 career families. How a person can track their own development in these different careers and improve as they go along. And when we improve, professionalize these 9 career families and give our folks the access to professional development that they deserve, we're thwarting privatization in that way as well, because our ESP then are no longer, you know, just low-skilled service workers that a privatizer feeds upon. You know, these are now folks with specific skills connected to the welfare of the students, and it makes them more difficult to privatize. Kind of look on my board here to see if we've had some more questions come in or not. There's a lot of activity in the chat, but so I need to take a moment and see which of these are questions. So bear with me just a moment. Okay, just some good discussion going on. Not any direct questions to me. If you've got some questions, we've got some time. I think I surprised myself and talked faster than I that I thought I was going to. So we've got a little time if you've got anything regarding ESP and privatization that you would like to put on the table. So the Anti-Privatization work group and the Community Connections work group, they have merged to work on a lot of these privatization issues now, and I do know that, those two groups are going to be in the process of developing some different anti-privatization webinars and trainings, so we'll be looking forward to that. So much of what we're doing now is connected with the professional development for the ESP career families in specialized areas that gives them an edge against thwarting the privatizers. So you'll see a lot more of that happening out there as well. Let's see. Got a question that just came up. Yeah. I got a question about the new era and not a good era that we're entering concerning collective bargaining. What the question is referring to is this spring we're facing what could possibly be a really devastating court case. It's called Janus versus AFSCME. Janus is an individual's last name, and AFSCME stands for American Federation of States oh gosh, I used to know this by heart. American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. Sorry about that. So that case is coming before the Supreme Court in the spring, and the reason it is presenting such a challenge is that it is challenging the right of what's called fair share, and particularly on the two coasts, a few other places too, but particularly on the two coasts, you have states with strong collective bargaining laws for public employees, and in those states we've been able to negotiate what's called fair share, which means that you don't have to be a member, but if you're not a member, you still have to pay a fee for the benefit you get of the union being in the district. So you basically pay a fee for what the union invests in your advocacy, with the exception of political activity. And those are fair share states, predominantly, like I say, on the east and west coast. But where the challenge comes in for our union as a whole is that those fair share fees on both coasts drive a lot of funding and programs for the rest of the country as well. So, you know, you may be a state that has never had public employee collective bargaining for your ESP or teachers, and so you're used to working in that environment, but where even you will be challenged is the fact that there'll be less overall money for the NEA to work with. But in addition to that, you know, there's going to be other attacks on collective bargaining in addition to the going after our due structure through fair share. And, you know, this puts us in, I don't want to say a good position, but it puts us in somewhat of a position of readiness in the work that we've been doing in ESPQ around all this professional development and professional growth continuum for these 9 career families, because what we've done is found another way for the union to add value to that membership. So, you know, the union is now becoming a conduit for me advancing in my career through the professional growth continuum, through the supplying of appropriate and timely professional development. So, you know, in that sense, we've added another value. So, you know, maybe we are in a situation now in some states where, you know, we can't go to the bargaining table and bargain a collective bargaining agreement for you, but we can help advance your career. So that's one way to look at it. You know, one thing I try to tell people to keep in mind is to remember that unions existed a long time in this country before we had the legal framework that made it easier. You know, we didn't get the legal framework until Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the late 30s got the National Labor Relations Act passed, and then states later on, particularly by the 1970s, started to mirror that with their own public employee bargaining laws that often mirrored the National Labor Relations Act. But a long-winded way of saying that we existed for a long time before that framework, based on, you know, organizing and solidarity without the legal framework. So these are going to be challenging times, but we've been there before and lasted through it. You know, and I think a combination of organizing and other value-added aspects to the union will help see us through. So let's see. I'll take another question from the board. Okay, got a question on what is the best way to begin a relationship with the president of the board. You know, one of the questions that we gave in this presentation, I'm really sincere about the idea of establishing a regular informal meeting with this individual. For example, let's say you're the president of the paraeducator local in your school district, you know, and you just establish a routine where every first Monday of the month you're going to have coffee before school starts with this individual, and it becomes a routine. That individual and you as the president just know that every first Monday of the month you're meeting for coffee, and it's not under the gun when there's just a problem, just a situation you have. It's a regular thing that you do, a regular sharing of information back and forth. I think that is really one of the most powerful ways. And again, if you don't have that type of relationship or capacity to right away establish this, you know, go back to the fundamental. Go back to attending those board meetings, getting your face and name out there, and then working up to you know, the more sophisticated forms of activism. Okay, how do we encourage better professional development? Don't forget, folks, that the Every Student Succeeds Act is still out there and still new. We've really only been functioning under it for about a year, and it is true that state plans are completed and already a done deal, but a lot of local plans are not, and plus local plans are usually revisited annually anyway. And so what you can do as ESP is that you can approach your district and say, look, you know, I'm aware of the new ESSA law that really our local plan should be being developed with timely and meaningful consultation of stakeholders, including paraeducators, and I want to be at the table. I want to help you get this thing done. And, you know, get yourself on the ESSA implementation team. And once you're on that team, that's the table where they discuss how they're going to spend federal professional development money. And when you're at the table there as an ESP advocate, you can advocate that ESP get a little piece of this professional development themselves. I mean, you know, it's ridiculous that we don't have instructional paras go through PD with the teacher that they're going to work with for the year, so that they learn how to work as an education team and each know their responsibility and boundaries. You know, and that's the sort of thing that you can advocate for once you're on the inside of the ESSA process. We should not forget ESSA is still a new and useful tool out there, and that, you know, for the first time, ESP have more of a play in this development of local consolidated plans and how PD money is spent, et cetera, et cetera. Paraeducators are mentioned specifically in the federal statute as specifically they should be at the table in the development of these local plans. Other ESP families are not mentioned that specifically, but they're implied as other appropriate staff, and, you know, in given situations, you could easily make the argument that they should be at the table as well. All right. So let's see, got a question about, let's see, it's about some of the mechanics of privatization. Yeah, I'm not quite clear on this question, but I'll go over a part of the privatization again, and hopefully I will clear up oh, here, I'm sorry. The individual is writing more on their question. Oh, okay. Yeah, Mike, your understanding is accurate. You're saying that your understanding is that basically everyone is terminated or laid off, and they need to reapply for these positions when they're privatized, losing seniority, et cetera, et cetera. Well, your understanding is accurate. That is how it works. Now, often these privatizers who you know, have trouble getting them people to work for them anyway, often they will offer employment to our members, but you have to understand that one way or the other, they're going after those members' compensation. A lot of times what they'll do is they will offer them their position back at a decent hourly rate, but there will not be any pension or health benefits. And then once they get our former member in there at that hourly rate, they never advance, and they generally don't keep them around a long time because they're also trying to get more work product with fewer folks as well. So they're really pushing our folks. But yes, Mike, your understanding is right. When a privatizer comes in there, there's certainly no guarantee that the privatizer will rehire our people. They do make them often do make them interview for the positions, interview for their own jobs, so to speak. And when they do come back, what's usually missing on the front end is the benefits, especially if there were health benefits or pension benefits. Got a question on how often private companies have to re-up their contracts. That will actually be in the contract that the district ends up signing with the private contractor. You know, it's really what was in the RFP and what was negotiated with the privatizer. You know, they can be anywhere. Usually, you see anywhere from a year to 3 years. I've been seeing a trend lately of the food service management companies getting thrown out on their ears, which is good. Some other career families that get privatized, it's tougher to get those privatizers out of there once they're in, even if they're doing a lousy job. And of course, one of the big examples of that is transportation, particularly if the privatizer brings their own, comes into the deal with their own buses or buys the district's buses. Once you go down that road, it is tough to ever get those privatizers out of there because the district doesn't want to belly up to the bar with the hundreds of thousands of dollars that it would take to buy a new fleet of buses again. But it really varies, and you can FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, for the contract that the district has with the private contractor, and somewhere in that contract will be the duration of the contract. Okay. That looks like it may be it on the questions. So an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I hope that we've given you some ideas on thwarting privatization, ideas that start with very doable tasks and then build and escalate the activism to a level of sophistication that you've become comfortable with because you've been building step by step. So thank you all for your time this evening. You know, as I say, go forth and organize, and it has been a pleasure to be able to share some of this with you and to take your questions, et cetera, et cetera. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim, for that informative presentation on how ESP can play a role in helping to prevent privatization. There was a question that came up about from Mike about whether or not the web links that are listed in the web links box below are available via NEA.org. Most of those links will actually link on behalf of the Center for Great Public Schools in the NEA ESP Quality Department. I would like to thank you for taking the time to participate in today's session, and we look forward to you participating in future NEA webinars.